everyone, Johnny here, and welcome to our first session in a brand new series that we are calling Joyful. It's a study on the book of Philippians, and we're looking at what it means to live a life of joy, what it means to live this Christian experience in joy, and how that differs from happiness, and what that means for our actions and how we interact with those around us. And so really excited to start this study with all of us together. And if you have your scriptures with you, go ahead and open up to the book of Philippians, which is written by Paul. And this is written by Paul in prison. And as he's writing this letter to the Philippians, he's under condemnation for preaching the gospel, for sharing the message of Jesus Christ. And now just some quick background and context of where we're finding ourselves in this message. So Paul is in prison, but he's writing to a group of believers in the city of Philippi. And in the city of Philippi, it was a large Roman colony that was founded by Philip of Macedon, who, if you're into history, was the father of Alexander the Great. And so they were very proud Romans. They had all the rights of Romans. And when Paul preached there in Acts chapter 16, he actually formed and spoke to the first Christians in Europe. And so this is the first European group of believers that we find in the Bible. And for Paul, they had a special place in his heart because they supported his ministry from the very beginning. Although they were a smaller group, they didn't see him for very long. They really supported him, not just through prayers, but financially as well, and with food and things that he needed for his long and painful journeys. And this letter was written 10 years after he first saw them. And he hadn't seen them for 5 years when he wrote this letter. And so a lot of time has passed, but he starts off by saying, "I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you are all making my prayer with joy." So in every single prayer of his, he's remembering them and he's praying for them, and he's so joyful when he remembers them and all that they've done to help his ministry and all that they're doing to extend and further the gospel. So they have a very special place in his heart, and he's talking about joy. This letter was written not to necessarily lay out some important theological works like we see in the book of Romans, or to correct doctrines or teachings that were wrong like we see in his letter to the Corinthians, or even the Galatians when he says, "You foolish Galatians." To the Philippians, he says, I'm so joyful every time I think of you. I pray for you guys all the time. You bring me joy. And this word joy or joyful is found about 18 times in this letter. It's like a current in an ocean. It's found almost everywhere you look. And he's just expressing his joy and his love through this letter. And he's laying out some key Christian elements in the life of a believer. He's laying out the experience of having joy as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. And so in this evening, I want to share some aspects of joyfulness, and more specifically, the joy that is found in the gospel. So tonight's message is about the joy of the gospel. And Lord willing, in the next few weeks, we'll look at joy in other elements of our lives. But for now, we're going to look at the gospel. And so, what is the gospel? Well, in a nutshell, because we don't have a lot of time, it is the proclamation of the death, burial, resurrection, and appearance of Jesus Christ. And what that means for you and for me and for the world is that there is good news about what can be done about our sinful state. And that is that we were found to be sinful, enemies of God, and the good news, or the gospel, which is kind of the root word of this, is that there is a plan to take us out of that sin, and there's a price that was paid for that sin in order for us to live a life of fullness, a life of joy, more importantly, a life that follows Jesus and is in surrender to Him. And so Paul lays out a few interesting things about the gospel. And let's look at verse 7. So he's talking to the Philippians. So we're in chapter 1, verse 7. And he says, "It is right for me to feel this way about you all, with joy and with prayer, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel." So he uses a word there that's very interesting, the defense of the gospel. What does Paul mean by this? Does God need us to defend Him or the work that He's done? Do we need to do something to add on to the work of Jesus? Certainly not. That's not what this means. The word for defense has its roots in apology or in an argument. When you're in court, the judge asks the lawyer, "What's your defense? What's your argument? What's your side of the story?" And that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying we are offering up a reason for our side of the story. We are defending the work that Jesus has done. We are offering up a reason and talking about what Jesus has done for us. And it's important because there are people, Paul calls them dogs. I don't know if you're a dog lover, but this was an insult back then. He calls them dogs or evildoers that want to preach a different gospel, a different message. And Paul's saying, no, this is what the true meaning is. This is what we are proposing is the true gospel. And not just proposing, but we are seeing it evident by what Jesus has done in our lives and in the lives of others as well. And so to defend the gospel means to offer up a reason or an argument for why you believe what you believe. It's not that God needs our defense or for us to run to His defense. And in verse 7, Paul says that the Philippians helped him in this. They were in it during the good times and in the bad times. He says here, both in my imprisonment, the bad times, and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. So all the times that they proclaimed the gospel together. Now they didn't do this to appear lofty or to appear super intelligent or because they loved to have arguments and discussions and to act like lawyers and come up with all these arguments. No. They were in it because of Jesus. That's it. They were doing this because of what Jesus had already done in their life. If we think of the great apologists of our time, or the great Christian thinkers of our time, Ravi Zacharias, who passed away back in May, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, all these people who proclaimed the gospel and defended the gospel didn't do so to receive a paycheck or to speak in front of millions and earn money. They did it because they realized that they were sinners and that a price had to be paid for that sin. And the person who paid that price was none other than Jesus. And so they toiled and they labored and they spent hours and time and stress proclaiming and defending the gospel before millions because of Jesus Christ. It's as simple as that. It all comes down to Jesus. The gospel is Jesus. To preach Christ is to preach the gospel. And to preach the gospel is to preach Christ. It is both the works of Jesus and also Jesus himself. Without Jesus, there is no good news. Without the work he's done on the cross, there is no salvation from our sin. And so it's because of Jesus that they experienced this joy, and when they saw that others were trying to preach a different gospel, they're saying, no, we need to stand up for this. We need to stand firm. Paul had a conversion experience, as we all know, in Acts chapter 9, where his life was changed completely, and his mission was different than what it had been before. Not because he was intelligent or because he has studied for this, but because Jesus changed his life completely. And he lived to defend that message and to share that message, and to do so in a biblical way, to do so in a way that honored God and that honored Christ. Now here's something that's important. To defend the gospel means that we have to be willing to become defenseless ourselves. When we defend the gospel and when we promote the gospel, we have to be willing to take a back seat and even to be vulnerable. For Paul, this meant giving up his personal freedom. Remember, he was imprisoned at this time. For him, defending the gospel and preaching the gospel didn't mean the luxury of being in front of crowds or of others. It meant putting the gospel first, standing firm for it, but taking a back seat to the gospel. Having your ego and yourself come second. And here's what's interesting. When we are defending the gospel, sharing the gospel, standing up for what the gospel really means, and we're vulnerable, we're not really defenseless, God is on our side. And Scripture says that in our weakness, in our vulnerability, His strength is made not 50%, not 75%, 100% perfect in us. God comes to our defense. He doesn't need us to defend Him. But when He sees that we offer up our fears, our ego, our ambitions, our desires, and we say, I just want to talk about Jesus and what He has done in my life and to stand up for what the true message is, He sees that. And He honors that, and He comes to our defense. We are not alone. But God calls us to take a step, to take a stand, and to defend the gospel, to offer up a reason for why we believe what we believe, that it is the only way to salvation. And Paul realized that. Many people throughout thousands of years have realized that. And they preach the gospel, they preach Jesus because He has brought joy into their lives. So Paul says we must defend the gospel, and him and the Philippians experienced this together. And he continues, and he says in verse 12, also from chapter 1, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. So not only must we defend the gospel, we must extend the gospel as well. Jesus makes it very clear to us that as His disciples, our role, our job, is to go into the world and make disciples, to extend the good news, to extend the gospel. And Paul was actually called to be an apostle to the Gentiles, that is, to those who are not Jewish. So he knew his purpose, and he knew that the work that had been done in him, the joy that he experienced, needed to be shared to those that had not yet known Jesus, had not yet known His gospel, had not yet known His joy. Now here's what's interesting. When we think about extending the gospel or sharing the gospel or evangelizing, we think about trying to make something happen. We think about trying to be impressive or to do something. And yeah, that's true, but extending the gospel is not so much trying to make something happen, it's allowing the gospel to happen in you. It's allowing the gospel to change you from the inside out. I can tell you the number of missionaries that I've spoken to that say, Johnny, I was a sinner, I was a drug addict, I was a runaway, I was an ardent atheist, but something happened. Something changed. I met Jesus and I was transformed. And it's like that song by the Gators, something happened and now I know He touched me and made me whole. Something changed. Something happened. I'll tell you what happened. The gospel happened. Jesus happened in the life of Paul, in the life of all those missionaries, in the life of everyone who extends the gospel. Now let's be real, not all of us are going to a country in Africa or to Honduras to extend the gospel. But we are called to do so right where we are, because something has happened in us. And when we realize that our purpose is not just to try and make something happen for our own sake, it's allowing the gospel, which has transformed us, to make something happen in our lives and in the lives of others. That same power that has transformed and renewed our minds needs to be extended to others. It needs to come from the inside out. If we just try and go and present a bunch of arguments and use a lot of Greek and Hebrew to show how smart we are, we're not extending the gospel, we're extending ourselves. And when we get stretched too thin, we collapse, and people see that. But when we extend the gospel, and when we preach Christ and Christ crucified, again, Christ doesn't need us to defend Him. He comes and does the work. He gives power in His word. Romans 1:16 says that the gospel is the power to save anyone who believes in it. And that's why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not good of speech. I may be a little slow. I may be unintelligent. But I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it alone has the power to save. And here's what's interesting. Paul says that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. And he continues in verse 13, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Verse 14, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So two things have happened here. Paul realizes that in his present circumstance, God is using that to extend the gospel. The whole imperial guard are talking to one another and they're saying, wait a second, who is this Paul guy? Why is he here? He's a Roman citizen. I mean, why is he in jail? What's going on? And word is getting around. He's there because he is preaching the gospel. He is living for Jesus. And they start asking themselves, who is Jesus? What's going on? So the whole imperial guard, the prison guards are starting to talk about Jesus, or at least question, who is Jesus? If you remember in the book of Acts where Paul and Silas are in prison, and what did? They began singing. They began praising God and letting the joy that comes from knowing Jesus pour out. And Scripture says that other prisoners heard it. And then God used that experience and also released them from jail and shook the ground. But He used that experience that started from the joy of Paul and Silas singing to eventually have a prison guard come to them and say, sir, what can I do to be saved? God used their circumstance to extend the gospel to those who needed to hear it. To the point where a prison guard was coming to Paul and Silas asking what they need to do to be saved. When we think about extending the gospel, we should, and absolutely should, use our words to preach and proclaim the gospel. But we should also let our circumstance extend the gospel as well. In your prison, in your quarantine, in your isolation. Whatever it is, sing praises to God. Let the joy overflow from within you. Let the joy of Jesus supersede your current circumstance, whatever it may be. Let every happening be an opportunity for God to be glorified and for the gospel to be extended. We pray a lot of times, Lord, help me share the gospel. Help me to talk to others about it. And God gives us those opportunities, yet they may not always look like we want them to. Sometimes there'll be an opportunity of us speaking to someone. Other times it might be through our circumstance. So when other people look at you and look at me and how we deal with circumstances and our actions and our reactions, are they seeing God? Are they seeing the joy of Jesus? Are they seeing that we look beyond our circumstances and look instead to Jesus? And are they looking at us in such a way to where they say, I want what they have. That joy that they have, I'm jealous. I want to experience that as well. So when we live for Jesus, when we defend the gospel, when we are allowed to be changed from the inside, we can then extend the gospel through our words, but also through our actions and our reactions to our circumstances. So Paul continues. Not only do we need to defend the gospel and extend the gospel, but the gospel needs to be lived. And this is perhaps the most important aspect of finding joy in the gospel. We find joy not just in defending it or extending it, but ultimately in living the gospel. So let's go to verse 18, to where Paul says this in the second part of verse 18. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. And he continues in verse 21, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul knew that his life was to be lived for Jesus, no matter what. He had to live his life for the gospel, no matter what. Whether he died in prison, or whether he lived to preach another day. Ultimately, he had joy in knowing the true Jesus. And he encourages the church at Philippi in verse 27, and he says this, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. He's saying it's one thing to defend, to extend the gospel, to talk about it, to look at, not in their time, but in our time, to look at the Greek origins of the word and to appear intelligent. But really, if you're not living it, if you're not walking the walk, you're just talking the talk, it's for nothing. You're not living your life in a worthy manner. You're not living your life in a way that's glorifying God. It's glorifying you. He summarizes everything and says, let your life be found worthy of the gospel. Living your life in a manner worthy of the gospel. How then can we live? How then can we live our lives in the manner worthy of the gospel? He continues in verse 27. He says, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit. So that's one aspect. Living a life worthy of the gospel does not mean following a set of rules or legalism or moralism. Living a life worthy of the gospel means that you stand firm in what the gospel really means, which is that there is one that has done the work for us, that has saved us, not by our own works, not by our own moral code or law, but we stand firm together in the gospel. And he continues, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. We live our lives in a worthy way of the gospel by being united together, by being the family of Jesus, by loving one another, by showing that same love that Jesus showed us to every human relationship that we have. doing so, people will know that we are Christians. People will know that we're not just talking the talk, we are also walking the walk. And he continues in verse 28. And not be frightened in anything by your opponents. Paul's saying, don't let fear overcome you, but instead let joy come within you. These are just 3 small things that he's encouraging them with. He's saying, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel. In other words, live your life how Jesus lived, by showing love to one another, by standing up for what is right, and also by not letting fear overcome you, but being focused and glorifying the one who gives us joy, who gives us salvation. We don't live like this to be found worthy of salvation. We don't pretend to have joy and push and strive for joy in all times so that we may be saved. But we live our life like this because we are saved. There's a quote by a pastor named Brendan Manning, who said that the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. We are the hands and feet of Jesus. We are the church. We are setting an example by living how Jesus lived and by loving how Jesus loved. If we don't live this gospel, if we don't live Jesus, if we just talk about him, defend it, extend it for our gain, others will look at it and say, they're saying one thing, but they're acting completely different. So in this time of quarantine, in this time of isolation, wherever your circumstance might be, remember that you are the church. Remember that we are still followers and disciples of Jesus Christ. And the world needs to see this. The world needs to see this, and we need to remember it and have our lives be found in a worthy manner of the gospel. Not to try to earn our salvation, but because we are saved. And so, to wrap up our lesson and our message for this evening, I want to encourage you to live a life of joy. Live a life of joy that's found in living for the gospel. Defend the gospel because it is the person of Jesus and his message that has turned our sorrow into joy. Extend the gospel because we want to share that joy with others and show them that there is a plan out of their sin. There is a plan out of their misery. But most importantly, we need to live the gospel. Because if we don't live the gospel, but we try to do those other things, people will see through that. And not just people, Jesus will see through that. And our lives won't be found in the manner worthy of the gospel because we're not living Jesus. We're not breathing Jesus. And so over the next few weeks, Lord willing, we're going to look at some more aspects of living a life of joy and living how Jesus lived. And again, I'm really excited to go through this book with you all. This lesson has been very encouraging to me, has brought me a lot of joy, and I pray that it brings you joy as well. And so now, after this, we're going to break up into small groups and talk with your leader and answer some questions that relate to this message. And again, thanks for tuning in, and God bless you, and tune in next time.